So I would like to welcome another speaker who came from Slovakia, one of the countries sending their care workers especially to Austria. And he's going to give us a specific perspective on sending country more than receiving country. So I think it's great that we can hear the complexity of care mobility. I would like to welcome Miloslav Bahna. He is a senior researcher at the Institute for Sociology of the Slovak Academy of Sciences, where he currently serves as its director. His research focuses on international migration, quantitative comparative sociology, and quantitative survey methodology. He is a long-term representative of Slovakia in the International Social Survey Program and the CESDA ERIC Pan-European Infrastructure. His first book focuses on post-2004 EU enlargement, migration from Slovakia. It was published by Veda, the publishing house of the Slovak Academy of Sciences, in 2011. His book, Cross-Border Care, Lessons from Central Europe, was published by Palgrave Macmillan 2019, and he wrote it together with Martina Sekulová. And they focus on Slovak female care workers working in Austria in live-in care service. So please, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Petra, for the introduction, and thank you also very much for the invitation, actually, the opportunity to be in an in-person conference. It was first of this kind for me in the last 2 years. Like, all my conferences have been transferred to hybrid or online mode, so this makes it a very rare opportunity to meet people finally. This is a nice opportunity, and also it's a nice opportunity to speak right after Veronica's presentation, which saves me a lot of time and energy actually to introduce my case, because what I will speak about is exactly the same case which Veronica was speaking about, but I will kind of look at it from the perspective of our research, which we've published with Martina Sekulová. And one facet of this research was actually if there is work after care work. If you are once stuck in this kind of labor market, if there is a way back, if there is a step out of this labor market, and if you can find actually proper employment back home once you decide to. And when Petra announced this conference and invited me, I was thinking that this is a good time to actually combine the topic of the COVID disruption, which comes to this labor market, and the debate about what happens actually, how the careers post-care work look like. And to do so, I would first try to kind of convince you that the labor market the Slovak care workers enter in by providing care to Austrian seniors is a kind of a secondary labor market and fits well the description of the secondary labor market theory. And at the same time, I will try to have a look together with you if this COVID disruption really did change the patterns, or did change the way, or did enhance people to exit this kind of secondary labor market, if this was really a major event in this leaving, in the decision to leave this kind of labor market. And if this is indeed the case, then my question and what I will try to show what the secondary labor market approach tell us about actually who stays in these labor positions and who leaves. And I think I will have some answers to these questions. So what's this segmented or dual labor market theory? So it's basically a theory saying that in advanced capitalist societies, there is a tendency of the labor market to kind of divide into sectors. And typically this has been identified in research in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s, and typically in research of migrant communities. And the researchers, to name a few, is Doringer, Piore, which was very vocal in propagating this approach. They have been observing that there is a special type of market with its own kind of own ways of operation, which typically is valid for people who are part of migrant communities. And indeed, actually the first cases when this was being described as secondary labor market come from works on ghetto employment in the United States, and then later works from the 70s, they focused on Puerto Rican migrants in Boston or on Korean and other Asian immigrants on the US West Coast. And this kind of turn is important also for migration research as such, since it was a sign of shifting away from the dominant, excuse me, from the dominant now classical perspective, which kind of focused on topics like equilibria on the labor market and so by focusing more away from the agency of the migrants and more towards the structural forces of the capitalist economy, which create a demand for underpaid jobs, offering little or no career prospects in a particular type of labor market, which they described as the secondary labor market. So were the kind of connection lines between exploring informal care provision by migrants and the secondary labor market theory? Not so many until recently, but there was one common kind of narrative which was present in both, which connects these both approaches. Because when we speak about domestic work, many authors have frequently referred to it as a dead-end job. And this is very much the case as you describe a job in the secondary labor market. However, recently, Ranci and Sabatinelli made this observation, so I was not first to come with this observation that this kind of domestic labor market or provision, informal care provision in private households has very much many of the features of the secondary labor market. Ranci and Sabatinelli in 2014, they write that the private care market seems to perfectly conform to the main aspects that are peculiar of secondary labor markets in dual labor market regimes. Very low labor cost, hard working conditions with considerable insecurity, a mix of formal and informal arrangements, limited chances for job mobility, and high interpersonal relationship between employees, employers, and subordinates. I will also add what's important with regard to what I will speak further is also the tendency of the secondary labor market to retain its workers within the secondary labor market, to keep people in the secondary labor market and to gradually build up a barrier between the secondary labor market and the primary labor market, the one with the good jobs. So also a feature of the secondary labor market, little or no returns to education, and this we have shown with Martina Sekulova that this is pretty much the case also in case of the labor of the carers providing care to elderly in Austria. And so now I will kind of introduce in short the research we've done on care workers from Slovakia who stay in Austria for typically, as Veronica mentioned, for 2 weeks, and they return back home. That's the reason why we were able to do a survey on Slovak care workers in Slovakia, surveying them since they spent half of their time, half of their year back in Slovakia, and it turned out they were like pretty much very open and eager to describe their fates and their views. And we did a series of 2 surveys, which were filled at first in 2011, and in 2016 we made a second round of the survey. And I will focus on the 2016 survey, since in this survey we included also a sample of care workers who stopped being care workers, who have left the labor market at most 3 years ago. So they were surveyed in 2016, and there were care workers which quit in 2015, 14, and 13. So we had a sample of 143 ex-care workers to actually look at and answer the question actually if there is a work life after care work. Okay, so this is just the description of our sample, and this is one quote from the care workers themselves about how they kind of evaluate the experiences they have earned in the care work in Austria, and they said, this kind of work hardly moves you forward because it's not how to put it. Perhaps if I had a normal employment, then it would be more helpful. So this was not described as a normal employment; it was a particular employment. So finally, to the question: is there work life after care work? Much to our surprise, when we fielded the survey, there indeed is a work life after care work, because the assumption at the time when we were doing it was that usually you continue in this kind of arrangement until your retirement, and then you just quit active labor force at all. But as it turns out, in 2016 there were roughly half of our ex-care workers were actually back in the labor market in Slovakia after they stopped working in Austria. However, obviously there was a grain of truth in the assumption that the retirement exit is quite common. We can see that there were almost 30% of ex-care workers who were in retirement in Slovakia. And there is also a clear connection between the age of the care worker when he started working in Austria and his exit or her exit strategy after care work. As you can see, the older, the higher was the age when you started doing care work, the more likely it was that you ended in the retirement when you returned back home. And basically, and these carers who had a work life after doing care work in Austria, they were typically younger and entered the care work in their late 30s, and also did spend the shortest amount of time in Austria. So if you spend shorter amount of time in the secondary labor market, your chances of returning to the primary labor market are better. That's also the expectation from the literature on the secondary labor market. So how do the careers before and after spending time in the secondary labor market look like when we compare? I use this EGP class scale here for the employment of the care workers before. The before employment happened in Slovakia. The after employment also did happen in Slovakia. I've highlighted like the two marginal categories on the upper and on the lower end. And as you can see, there was a general shift towards out from the classes of the higher controllers or lower controllers, and more towards the unskilled worker class, which is labeled as 7A. If we look at the mobility table, which basically compares the employment you had previously with the employment you have after working in Austria, we can see that there was a considerably experience of downward mobility after care work. So if you found employment, if you entered employment back in Slovakia, was a quarter of those who returned back, they had they entered work in lower social class than they had previously before going to Austria. I will not show my regression analysis here, but we also did compare how does the length spent working in the secondary labor market in Austria compare to your chances of like experiencing decline in the prestige of your job you are doing back in Slovakia. And the result was that while if you were working in Austria for 2 and less years, you experienced typically there was no significant connection between suffering a declining prestige. But typically when you worked for 5 and more years, you did typically had a higher chance of experiencing declining prestige. What's new, it was not published in our work with Martina Sekulova, but it's important for what I will present regarding the impact of COVID. There is another additional factor which increases the probability of you experiencing downward mobility on the Slovak labor market, and this is being over 50, being 50 and older. So there is definitely a level of age discrimination at the Slovak labor market. Okay, so what actually was the impact of the COVID-19 crisis? So these are, have a look please at these three major lines. The top line is like the total count of care workers or self-employed women in Austria, which is very much in agreement with what care workers are. And we see a small glitch, small decline, small change here. I don't know if this cursor is seen. Yes. So this is what happened in overall. So very little change in trends, a small dip, but which has been had the tendency to recover. If we had this tendency of the Romanian care workforce to be stable, it was stable also after COVID. If there was this tendency of declining numbers from Slovakia, they continued to decline after March 2020. but nothing else changed. The trend didn't change. And this is a zoom in on Croatia and Hungary mostly, which were these lines down there, which we couldn't recognize the trend, and we see a similar tendency. So there were small increase in numbers from Hungary, and also did continue after the COVID first wave of COVID, and similar the growth of Croatian share of Croatian and numbers of Croatian care workers in Austria also continued with a small glitch at the beginning of the pandemic. But what I want to show before I conclude, the age composition of the care workforce has been changing, and the most striking example could be perhaps seen in the Slovak case. As you've seen, the numbers of Slovak care workers were declining and are declining since 2016. But if we look at decomposed by age categories, so we see there is a clear decline in the younger care workers, those who are aged 30 to 49, an extremely sharp decline, which you cannot probably see because it's very low on the table, of those very young care workers between like 15 and 29. And on the other hand, in these overall declining numbers, you see stability of numbers of care workers who are 60 plus. This tendency is visible to a different degree also with the Romanian care workers. And typically, if there is an age category increasing, is this the age category of 40 or 50 or 60 plus among the care workers? Quite pronounced also in the Hungarian case. You see the 50 plus are going up. The other age categories are stable. Croatian care workers, again, the same picture, 50 plus and 60 plus going up. So the care workforce in Austria from the Central and Eastern European countries is aging. Here are a few figures. For example, in Slovakia, the shift of those who were 60 and more went up from 15 to 27%. In Romania, this was from almost 10% to 15%. In Croatia, from 9 to 18. In Hungary, it was from 22 to 32%. So actually, a third of those Hungarian care workers in Austria are over 60. So what is my conclusion here? So we could observe no major disruption in trends before and after March 2020, which was kind of surprising for me, even when looking at the data. What does seem to be the case that when interest is waning, at least this is the case from Slovakia, the care work has the tendency to retain all the care workers. And you see here now coming the secondary labor market. And so you are in a double trap in a way as a Slovak care worker in Austria. At the same time, you are aging, so it decreases your chances of finding decent work back home since you are age discriminated at the local labor market. And at the same time, the more time you spend in the secondary labor market, the less is your kind of previous work experience typically recognized if you want to find back your employment typically in the career you have pursued before entering the Austrian labor market. So these two tendencies, the first tendency of the secondary labor market to retain its workers, and at the same time, the disadvantage you experience as an older, later middle-aged person at the Slovak labor market is coming together and creating a kind of a toxic combination for the care workers which are currently continuing their careers at the labor market in Austria, which indeed is a secondary labor market, as I wanted to stress once again. Okay, thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your great presentation. I think also it's really important for us, even most of us are qualitative researchers, to listen to the quantitative analysis, which is giving us totally different perspective. And also it's kind of rare in the care mobility studies to work with quantitative data, especially in our region. So thank you very much. So there is a question I see. Okay, two of you.
Okay, I will start. My question is, what's your explanation for that phenomenon? Like why it's like an aging population, and how it can be related with the pension schemes in the sending countries? Because, for example, I wrote an article about Romanian people who, because of all the dispossessions during the transition from socialism to capitalism, they will not have any pension, basically. So they are pushed to move, and by the Spanish labor market, they are pushed, of course, to the caring work. I mean, that it's not like their aim at the beginning. Their aim is to secure their future social reproduction in old age. It's like survival strategy, basically. Of course, it's not easy to then successfully realize it, because informality of this sector and so on and so on. So like all these inequalities are reproduced transnationally. So I wonder if you have any data, any information, or any reflections about that for other cases, because I know this. Like older female migrants from rural areas in Romania, from my ethnographic fieldwork, but like it was super interesting for me to see the quantitative data, like and see that they are aging also, like carers from other countries, but like the welfare states in those countries that you mentioned are also very weak.
Just it's related to the previous one, but of course there's a huge data problem. So is this aging a cumulative effect or a turnover problem, right? So entering and leaving, who's entering and leaving this sphere of employment, and then whether it's a cumulative, because I think it's very important to answer this question, for instance, with regard to the sustainability of the thing, and then how we understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I was wondering, the time scale, the time they spend seems to be crucial, 5 years and more. And I was wondering, is this also the time range in the first labor market, that if you have a job, that it shows you effect on your further employment? So this is the first question. Then I was wondering, I became very curious about, this terminological discussion you're engaging in. I'm not an expert at all in that, but like what you were saying about that the secondary labor market came up around migration and ghettoization of labor, or labor market in ghettoization, whatever. I was wondering, what is happening if this happens transnationally, and also if it is happening among a certain age group. And perhaps it's also time to find a terminology and a description of that, because this seems to be so typical for the sector that it is something women, for the reasons you just also mentioned, enter, at a later age. And related to our conference, I was wondering how far one characteristic of that kind of labor market then could be linked to the missing social reproduction of the workers.
Time to reply.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add, because maybe not everyone understand it, this pension thing, because like there is this law on social security in Europe that you can accumulate like contribution periods. Like that's why I asked about that. Like you emigrate to accumulate years that you would not have in Romania, so you can survive in your older age in Romania.
Okay, so if I have answers to the question why the workforce is aging, and this is also connected to Attila's question, I think, yeah. So if this is because like no one new is coming in, and the remaining carers are just getting older, yeah. So it's not only that, because we can compare actually how fast the aging effect is going on. So it's not only that, and you also see that when the labor force is kind of growing, like in Hungary, the aging effect is a bit kind of lower than in case of Slovakia, when this is declining. The aging effect was stronger, perhaps because primarily the younger carers were leaving and the older ones were staying on. What's the connection with the pension scheme? Probably Veronica has mentioned, and if not, then I can add that once you are in the self-employment scheme as a care worker in Austria, you are entitled for a pension in Austria. And this was a new thing which was connected to the legalization in 2006 afterwards. It was also connected with some expectations on side of the care workers. They were kind of hoping to have an Austrian pension. In many cases, this was kind of disappointing news for them when they finally actually got the pension from Austria, because since they were paying like the very minimum of the social security payments, contributions, their pensions were quite low. And I think if I remember correctly, what Martina has established, it was like 10 euros a year working on Austria was an increase in your pension. So it was not much even by Slovak standards. So, but definitely there is this expectation that the longer you work in Austria, this connection. So it is connected to your pension. So this could be another incentive actually to stay and even work there once you are 60 plus or something, particularly if you've spent there a long time and you have had little employment history in Slovakia or stopped working in Slovakia once you were 45 and then continued for 15 years to work in Austria particularly. And there was the question about time experience, about how much time it takes to actually have like work experience on which you can capitalize on in the primary labor market. I'm unaware of this kind of analysis with regard to the primary labor market. This was mostly analyzed with regard to the secondary labor market in as far how much damaging is it to be in the secondary labor market, since one of its features was that it provides no recognition for experience and it provides no recognition for your education, which is also typical for the care workers. It's regardless you have a university degree, you have a maturita, or you have a lower degree of education. We have shown and we can demonstrate in our data that it didn't have impact on your wage. Actually, the only human capital attribute or variable which was influential and connected to your salary in Austria was command of German. Actually, the better you speak the language of the local labor market, it pays off to speak the language of the labor market. And with regard to ethnicity, the secondary labor market actually has a subgroup or works with this ethnic niche labor market model, which kind of it's an interesting case as it combines features of the primary and the secondary labor market. This is typically you kind of have some Asian communities in US cities, and once you kind of enter this ethnic secondary labor market, it holds you within the labor market, but there is a career from kind of selling food and waiting the tables. You can kind of climb up the ladder and end up as an owner of the business, for example. So this is an ethnic niche secondary labor market type of employment, type of labor market, which is kind of in between. It's highly ethnicized, but at the same time kind of provides some kind of career prospects and rewards for experience. So there is this connection I can figure out.
Thank you very much. I just perhaps want to add my own ethnographic experience from my current research with Czech care workers working in Germany, that we can see also that there is a changes in population, because most of them are 60 plus, and when I have conducted interviews with them, they are framing their need to work in a rotation migration in Germany and then to work in a live-in service as actively preparing for their distant retirement, because they are because how social reproduction in society is functioning, it's discriminating them from their social rights in terms of unpaid care work during their life trajectories. Also pay gap in a Czech society, or another gender inequalities caused by structural inequalities and how social reproduction in like our societies are functioning. So yes, so I can just I just wanted to add this impression or information from the field. Thank you very much for your presentation. There is a time for lunch, so I have to cut it now. Even I'm sure that there are so many questions for other presenters as well.